and welcome to this extended hour-long edition of IIEA Insights with me, Dan O'Brien. The turmoil in transatlantic relations is such that I'll skip the usual short introduction and go straight into introducing the speakers who are joining us today to discuss Ireland-US relations now and in the future. Brian Jensen is the former head of the Office of Political and Economic Affairs at the American Embassy in Dublin and a retired civil servant with extensive experience in international trade matters in particular. Niamh King is the director of the Aspen Security Group and the Aspen Security Forum. Niamh will have to exit the discussion at 5 o'clock for another engagement. So could I ask people to send their questions in the first half hour only directed at Niamh? It'll just make it a little bit easier to put a question or two to her towards the end of the first half hour. Fergal O'Brien is the executive director of Ibec, and he joins us from Washington, D.C. after having a few, I'm very sure, dull meetings yesterday in the US Capitol. After finishing his lecture at 5 p.m., Larry Donnelly, who's the founder and director of the Clinical Legal Education Program at the University of Galway's School of Law, will join the discussion for the second half hour. This event is on the record and will be made available as a podcast shortly, with the exception of members' comments and questions. So thank you all joining us today. All of you are on the west side of the Atlantic. So thank you for taking the time out of what I'm sure is a very busy week for you all. Just as a starter, we might go in alphabetical order and just get very quick takes on what happened yesterday and what it might mean. Brian, welcome, over to you.
Thank you. Well, I probably am like the least attentive observer to what's going on in Washington this week of the panel, so I'll keep this one brief. One of the biggest things that jumped out to me is just how much better of a meeting it was than, say, the Zelensky meeting a week ago. Entirely different tone. Personally, from my point of view, I simply wish that only one of the two had been on camera instead of both, but because with the Taoiseach, it was a much better, much more cordial conversation. So no, I'll just leave it at that for that, because this is a little out of my purview for the moment.
Appreciate that, Brian. Niamh, your thoughts?
Yeah, actually, I agree on the headline. He definitely, the Taoiseach dodged a bullet compared to recent bilaterals in the Oval Office. And, there was the levity of the Vice President's shamrock socks and conversations about golf, and river dancers are always a crowd pleaser. I think Ireland's soft power reigned supreme and it was out full force. President Trump, he did complain of Ireland's massive trade surplus. And of course, he was referring to trade in goods only, as he does. But, as we all know on this webinar, the overall bilateral trade picture, including services, is somewhat less imbalanced. So I think it pays to emphasize that. He did also refer to wanting to keep the Irish-American vote and express warmth towards Ireland. And that's a rare thing for Trump to do, I would say, so far. So I think Ireland can play to that. What I think comes up is the best way to appease President Trump is to announce big dollar, exciting investments in the US. And even if these investments don't amount to much in practice, a big headline announcement seems to always go down well with him.
Just the same question to you, and also on that big ticket issue, any mention of LNG? I've been sort of advocating that the Irish government make a big thing about sourcing LNG from the US. Did you hear anything around LNG yesterday?
So yeah, Dan, I think overall, look, I think yesterday was very positive from an Irish perspective. There's no certainties with this administration, so I don't think anyone, would have been overly confident in advance that kind of unique Irish relationship was still as strong as we've always come to kind of rely on. But it was very evident yesterday. And I suppose probably one of the recurring themes that we saw both from the Oval Office and all of the conversations that we've been having here in DC this week has been the differentiation between the member states and the European Commission and the EU as a whole. And you saw that very strongly, I think, in the Oval Office yesterday, that Ireland wasn't being blamed really for anything, So again, it was very it was respectful, it was positive. And the challenges in the relationship were all predominantly put down to the EU issues. Specifically on the LNG question, I think what the US is looking at, to Niamh's point, those transactions really matter. So absolutely, they should be part of those conversations. But the question that we're being asked here in DC, well, if the Commission turns up and says we're going to buy LNG, who actually ships it? Who actually makes the purchases? and the Commission doesn't have that capacity, clearly, as we know. So we're going to need to see member states, back up any specific commitments or proposals that the Commission may put on the table as part of those kind of broader negotiations. But it does seem very clear that, these negotiations, they won't just be about trade or investment. There'll be security, defense, energy, potentially tax, and everything is really going to get blended into the mix. And then how you actually operationalize those in terms of member states making those happen, I think, is going to be a big challenge in terms of coordination from an EU perspective.
That's really interesting. So does that mean, Fergal, there's a possibility that the announced April 2 tariffs on the EU would be further delayed if it's wrapped into a bigger picture? Or any thoughts on that?
Well, we know this administration has a penchant for urgency and speed. So I don't know if it means that, but it means there's a lot to do between now and then.
Okay, right. Niamh, can I come to you on your sense of where the American public opinion is on the more isolationist, in some areas, isolationist strategy? I see Donald Trump's opinion polls are holding quite steady, and they're actually still in positive territory, which I don't think he was in positive territory at any time during his first term. Is isolationism more fashionable in the United States, or is it just foreign policy is just a less salient issue for most people when they're thinking about approvals?
Yeah, well, I think there's definitely isolationist sentiment in America, Middle America, and there always has been. But I'm not sure I believe that President Trump won last November because of that. I think I'd probably argue it was driven more by inflation in the economy. But I mean, nevertheless, he is a transatlantic skeptic and a NATO skeptic. And some of his foreign policy stances seem to amount to a repudiation of 80 years of American and Europe transatlanticism. Secretary General of NATO, Mark Rutte, is in Washington today. In fact, I think they're meeting right now, and I'll be very curious to hear the outcome of that meeting. I think it'll be quite telling. And, in thinking about this, Dan, I used to work at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and they've done amazing polling on all of these for the last 50 years about America and their sentiment on this. And I looked into the recent data. Public support for alliances and NATO remains solid. However, 43% of Americans publicly polled think that, the US should stay out of world affairs. And in 50 years of polling, it's the lowest recorded answer to that question since 1974. And, this proposes a profound challenge to Europe as a whole, and, that includes Ireland. And, some of the conversations we're hearing now around Europe's Sputnik moment, taking security into its own hands, I think this is going to force Ireland to think about neutrality and its stance there and how it might participate in a Euro defense community. And that's a conversation that I don't think in Ireland anyone thought we would be having now, but I do think it's important. A lot of countries like Germany, Canada, France, Denmark, and to some extent the UK are thinking about a post-American world, or a world in which the US under Trump isn't the ally that we've counted on for the last 80 years. So, it is a transformative time, and time to start thinking a lot here in the US and I think also in Ireland about what that looks like. Those are hard questions.
Very, very hard. It's quite an emotive issue in Ireland.
Yeah.
Brian, in terms of that, not only the sort of security dimension has changed so much in recent weeks, but also the tariffs. Of course, we have to wait until April 2nd. But if your neighbours to the north and south are anything to go by, there will be quite an unprecedented. Even going back to the 1930s, the scale of potential tariff increases is huge. How do you think small open economies on this side of the Atlantic can do anything to mitigate that, or is there really no way? We'll just have to respond to it as best we can, but there's no real way of mitigating it.
Yeah, that's a great question. First, if I can go back just briefly to defense spending, I
Sure.
would like to point out that Trump is not the first president to talk about NATO increasing defense spending. Under Obama, they made an agreement. The NATO countries agreed to reach 2% of defense GDP on defense spending. Bush was talking about it before him. Biden was talking about it. The style has changed. Donald Trump talks about it much more loudly than any of his predecessors. But in some ways, you could argue that's the most normal aspect of his presidency. It's the most continuous thing from previous administrations that I can think of off the top of my head that he's doing. So he's doing it differently, but he's doing it in a certain way. Now, when it comes to tariffs, I would point out that Donald Trump is the kind of guy who wants wins, but you have to keep in mind that he, in essence, is a salesman. That's how he did it, ran his business, and that's sort of how he's running his presidency. He wants you to buy what he's selling, literally as a businessman, but figuratively as a president, or buy American goods at least. And if he can make something appear as a win, even though it's not necessarily a substantive win, he's happy to spin it that way. I mean, politicians everywhere do that, but he leans into that a little more than most, shall we say. For example, during his first term, towards the end, while I was still employed and he was my boss, he pushed for a big trade deal with China. He got something that was called the Phase One Agreement. If you don't happen to remember Phase Two of the China Trade Agreement, don't feel bad because it doesn't exist. And Phase One itself was so notional that I tend to think of it as a work of fiction. It was just paper saying, hey, we're going to buy more, you're going to buy more, and it's great. And nobody ever talked about it again afterwards because nothing ever happened. He also, well, early on in the term, pushed for a really quick renegotiation of the FTA we have with South Korea. And on paper, that was nothing but concessions by the Koreans towards us, but in practice didn't alter trade flows in the slightest, which was supposedly the impetus for renegotiating that agreement. So the appearance of a win is something he's perfectly willing to accept. And then when he just claims a win and moves on to something else. So if you didn't really notice the substance, well, you're being distracted and there's more noise, anything after that. Now, in terms of small countries and what they can do, well, there's a certain advantage in being a small country sometimes because you're falling under the radar. The bigger the splash, the bigger the announcement, the more likely it is to get attention. And small countries don't necessarily bring that. But in diplomacy, we have a concept called deliverables. Whenever there's a big meeting coming up, whether somebody important is visiting a country where I was assigned as a diplomat, for example, or coming to the U.S. or a summit of some kinds, we like to drum up a list of things that the U.S. government in particular has done recently, is doing at present, or is going to announce, or is ready to announce at that time that they will do in the future. And so I think a wise move for a country like Ireland might be to look at things that the country is doing or working on regardless of U.S. interest, but be prepared to frame those as a deliverable for the U.S., a way that suggests that Trump had an influence on that decision. For example, Dan has recently uh, discussed whether or not Ireland needs to up its defense spending. And if the Taoiseach were to tell Donald Trump he was right about spending more on defense, then even if that's not necessarily the reason they do that, then why not? So I think that's one way that a small country can avoid the tariffs because Donald Trump is threatening tariffs and he wants something in return. And if you offer something in return that's technically not something in return, but looks like it,
Yeah.
you can claim that as a win and move on.
Flattery gets you everywhere, I suppose. Brian, just to follow up, and this is one to all of you, has anyone picked up on any possibility that the US would tariff EU member states differently? Now, of course, the EU will have a tariff on US goods. It's the common external tariff. There's no question about that. But is there a possibility that in order to divide and rule, that, for example, a 50% tariff is levied on Danish goods and 0% tariff levied on Ireland after this sort of meeting and all things, for example? Anyone picking up on that as a possible tactic on the US side?
I suppose
Brian?
again, sorry, Dan, I was just going to say with this administration, you never say anything is impossible, right? So what we knew before, we would have definitely said an impossibility in the past. And we've definitely discussed it with people here this week. It's very hard to see how it could be administered, technically. So while, yes, as Brian said, they are looking there's definitely country by country work happening. There's no question, right?
Yep.
And the reliance and the predominance of sectors and strategic sectors by country. But to have differentiated tariffs across the EU, I think looks just administratively too difficult. I think one of the things that's also important in all of the work that needs to be done at a federal level over the next number of months is just the sheer disruption that's happening across all of the federal functions of the state at the moment. The experienced heads are leaving, have taken packages for retirement. Contractors, recent joiners have been let go. So there is a capacity challenge, even for a system as large as the US. There is a capacity challenge to actually do this kind of technical work, to really upend, your trading relationship. So I think that is a barrier to something maybe as kind of targeted as that. So I think there will be talk of kind of country by country issues, and clearly they'll be looking at strategically important sectors. Actually administering it just looks too complex, I think.
Okay, Brian, do you have a take on that? As you say, Fergal, it's pretty unpredictable, but it does certainly strike me as a really good way of dividing and conquering. And the hostility towards the EU yesterday in the press conference was very notable. If you want to divide and conquer, Brian, do you have a thought on the complexity of administering different tariffs in different EU member states?
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what Fergal said, that regulatory wise, it's going to be extremely difficult. I fully suspect that there's a will to do that, but implementing it is quite a challenge. And it's easy for Americans to look at Europe as kind of unitary in that regard anyways. They're making decisions together in a lot of ways, so it's not too much of a stretch to try to press Europe as a whole and just apply single tariffs, across the board to all the countries and all the exporters at the same time. So,
and just picking up on Fergal's point about state capacity, do you see that here from former colleagues, people in the system? Is degradation to State Department, to the various bodies, is it being affected by these layoffs and threats of layoffs?
With respect to tariffs, I don't know
No, just in
specifically,
general.
just in general, yeah.
Capacity.
Well, let's dial back 8 years if I can, because that's when Trump was elected and implemented. He really just tried to sideline the State Department. He basically ignored us. Our expertise was kind of irrelevant, and then he instructed his secretaries of state to simply try to cut the budget as much as possible. About a third was their goal at the time. So I think we're expecting more of the same, but just a stronger push right now. So yeah, it's not encouraging, and all that expertise and all the years we've spent learning things is for what at this point?
And Niamh, same, I suppose, question to you, just in terms of what you're picking up regarding the capacity of the federal government, federal agencies, and then also bringing it back to Ireland. What sort of advice would you give for a small country? Is possibly the best way to deal with this administration, to stay below the radar as much as possible?
Yeah, I mean, I think staying below the radar, Dan, is an understandable posture, but it's not necessarily a strategy. Like, we see examples of President Trump not exactly being a great respecter of smaller countries. I mean, the recent actions against Canada, where whoever thought that Canadian-US relations would be headline news? And Canada isn't that small compared to Ireland. That kind of gauges his attitude, and Denmark and Greenland as well too. I mean, I think one of our deep strengths lies in the Irish American community. They were talking about it this morning at the Northern Ireland breakfast, 35 million strong. That's a big number. And as well as the US business world that are very heavily invested in Ireland and have a very deep vested interest in continued attraction as an FDI destination. But as far as prosperity and security, the future for those for Ireland lie in Europe. And that's why the neutrality, not to bring it up again, it's not an obvious stance to me in an age, where some are calling it the revenge of geopolitics. And, Ireland needs to act accordingly. America has turned, so it would seem, and its friends and allies must look urgently for other ways to secure their prosperity in the future. I mean, the best that can be aimed for presently might be damage limitation, and that would include being under the radar. But I don't think that enough is alone. That alone is enough for us, for Ireland to, secure the next few years.
And in terms of gives that Brian mentioned, do you see things that Ireland could possibly give? For example, make a play of bigger defence spending. I don't think Micheál Martin brought that up yesterday, that there is a plan to increase defence spending. Is that something? Is Ireland just so small and a non-member of NATO that the defence side of things is not such an issue? Were anyone hearing of Ireland being considered a free rider on defence issues? Niamh?
I don't know if it features that largely, Dan, in the picture, to have people talk about it like that. It's not the first thing you think of because of our history. But, to the point that Brian was making about big announcements and deliverables, even if Ireland were to say, we'll double or quadruple defense spending, that's making an effort towards doing something that the Trump administration, that, Europe is moving towards the direction of greater security itself, without the US possibly. I think, that's a headline right there that could be put forth.
And Brian, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to interject and say, well, defense spending isn't going to be one of the things the administration will ask. The huge goods trade deficit is going to be a headline figure, and Donald Trump has picked up on the theme that that Ireland has stolen American companies and placed, Irish jobs at work when they should be in America, sort of thing. I think that's the topic that our side is going to raise on this, and Ireland can respond in different ways and bring defense into the discussion, but I don't think Ireland can stay below the radar with those sort of numbers that are going on right now in terms of both jobs and trade.
Okay.
But that'll be the one issue that gets the attention.
Okay, good. And in terms of pharmaceuticals, again, that it came up very explicitly. The US president was very aware of that. He mentioned that he would have put a 200% tariff on pharmaceutical goods coming from Ireland had he been around at the time. Pharmaceutical companies started setting up here, but there's a certain irony there that his trade and tax legislation from 2017 actually incentivized American pharmaceuticals to relocate, and a lot of it comes from the big increase in exports from Ireland to US and pharma has come over the past 7 or 8 years. But do you think there are measures by which the US administration could move to pressure the US pharmaceutical sector in Ireland to reshore to the US?
Off the top of my head, I'm not sure. That's one of those areas that's difficult. And pharmaceutical in particular, it takes a long time to make these decisions. And pharma is, from my experience with dealing with pharma, is all about efficiency. They want as few manufacturing sites as possible for any given product, and just so they can do it as expertly and efficiently as possible. So drumming up new manufacturing sites just to make the president happy is a very difficult ask.
Yeah, and reshoring takes time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
under any industry, but I think in pharmaceutical,
Exactly.
at least more than average.
It is the type of regulation that we're looking at, means that the timelines for new projects, licensing approval, all of these things is incredibly complex. But you're absolutely right to say that the administration is obsessed with the goods deficit, right? So we're not taking a whole of trade perspective and the interlinkage between services and goods in this modern economy. But at the same time, in terms of those conversations with Europe, they're very clear in terms of what they see as kind of the non-tariff barriers, so the access, the regulatory barriers, the compliance obligations on US business in Europe. Most of those probably relate to services, actually. So while on one side we're talking purely about trade deficit in terms of goods, in terms of the issues that they want Europe to address, a lot of them are to do with the services, and the services opportunity for US business in Europe remains colossal. Hundreds of millions of the wealthiest, best consumers in the world for digital and other sectors, and the growth that we continue to see in digital economy. That remains the prize for US business in the European Union. And that will be a very big part, I think, of this whole kind of negotiation process as it plays out over the next while. The other thing, Dan, just on the manufacturing relocation, it's very obvious here in the US that the scale of labor shortage in manufacturing
Right.
is quite colossal and has been for some time. And it's a real limiting factor in terms of bringing the factories back, right? Whatever about those sectors of the economy, but bringing the factories back. In most cases, the US doesn't have the sheer labor and will also really struggle not to have the capability and the expertise that you can get in a location such as Ireland. So none of those things will be easy. And I don't think corporate tax will matter, because corporate tax in the planning horizons, companies are thinking, 5, 10, 20 years, not, a sugar rush of a reduced tax rate for the lifetime of one administration. So that the long-term view really, really matters in that planning.
Yeah, I think just to triple underscore that, Fergal, that's right. The workforce issues are just massive. So you're absolutely right there. I
Pleasure,
look
and
forward
thanks
to
for
seeing
giving
you
us your
back in
time here.
Dublin. Okay,
Absolutely.
cheers. Thanks
Thanks.
all. Goodbye. Bye.
Larry, you're very welcome. As Niamh steps out, Larry steps in. Hope your lecturing went well. Maybe just ask you your wider take. I've introduced you already at the top of the show, as they say. Your sort of wider take on the first 6 weeks or so of this administration.
Yeah, well, thanks very much, Dan, for having me. And it's nice to make an adjustment from teaching first-year students straight into political developments. Yeah, I mean, look, it has been 6 weeks, I think, of what you can only describe as shock and awe, both at home and outside the United States. And there were some who wondered, in the wake of his election, would President Trump actually live up to some of the things that he said on the campaign trail, or whether this was about vindication, that he was in this to right the wrong he saw done to him in 2020, and to deny the Democrats who he loathes the White House. I think the answer is pretty clear at this stage, that he meant everything he said. I think if you were to say what the hallmark has been, it certainly has been disruption at every level. And indeed, each and every day, we wake up and the world wakes up uncertain of what will come next. So I think that is where we're at, and I think we continue to see it unfold on a daily basis. I think from my own point of view, and we may get into this, I think it has opened up a real fissure or gulf between, or exposed a fissure or gulf between the thinking of very many Americans and the thinking of very many Europeans, given that Donald Trump's numbers at home, and of course they could change, especially if inflation stays high and prices increase with the advent of tariffs and other things. But to me, the story is not that his presidential approval rating is at historic lows. My take is that the fact that it is either in the mid to high 40s, despite everything that we have seen, is nothing short of extraordinary, and demonstrates again that Americans think and see the world very, very differently, in particular to people in Western Europe.
Yeah, Niamh mentioned the Chicago Council of Global Affairs has been polling, and it found that 43% of Americans favor a more isolationist policy. And she mentioned that's the highest in 50 years of polling. Would that reflect your contacts back in the US, that there is a sort of, look, we've led the world for long enough, it's time to look inwards and look after our own affairs? Do you sense that's a stronger position held by people popularly in the US?
I think, like most Americans, I mean, one of the things I don't like to see is Americans who are, and I think this is increasing element of things, is Americans who live in a bubble and don't have close associates with a range of different views. I think that the people who either personally or professionally who I associate with have, or am in contact with, have a mixture of views. What I will say, though, is that those who have always been on the conservative end of things, they have increasingly embraced a different version of conservatism than one that I know for a fact they used to espouse. And those who back in the day would have been very critical of the likes of Pat Buchanan, who sought the presidency in 1992, 1996, and 2000, who would have found him a threat to the conservative principles that they always espoused. Now they sound very much like Pat Buchanan, because speaking frankly, that is who President Trump is echoing, whether he likes it or not. And modern conservatism, at least what passes for conservatism in the GOP as of now, is Buchananite conservatism, not Reagan-esque conservatism.
Stark, Brian, just flipping a bit, picking up on Fergal's point about the services side of the relationship, and US tech companies in particular, a huge presence along with pharmaceutical companies in Ireland. Could that all get tangled up? As Fergal says, everything's going to be in the mix here. Could the US tech companies in Europe get caught up in all of this? If the Europeans retaliate and they retaliate against US tech companies, for example, is that something you see as part of all of this? Or do you think that US tech companies based in Europe could be sort of insulated in some way from a trade war?
Well, it's impossible to say they're completely insulated because there's so much unpredictability in so much levels. And I think the idea that they're employing a great number of people in Ireland and other places, but particularly Ireland or in the United States, could very well get some attention at some point. Although I think you see some of the leaders of those industries cozying up with the president right now, and I think that's going to go a long ways towards insulating at least specific companies, even if not the sector at large. Yeah, I think that's really, I feel like they're mitigating it for domestic reasons, but it might bear results for them internationally as well.
And Fergal, coming to you on that topic, is there a risk that the European side wants to clamp down on American tech for a whole range of reasons? And this could and Ireland gets caught up in this, the tech sector and Ireland gets caught up in this. Is this something you'd be concerned about? You're hearing about?
I think if anything, Dan, I'd hope we're going in the opposite direction. I think, you talk about, look, what's every country going to do to mitigate some of these geopolitical risks at the moment? And it is back to their own controllables. And Europe's been very clear in terms of its Draghi letter report, competitiveness compass, what we've already seen in terms of sustainability reporting, burdens, regulations, that, doing business in Europe is not easy, right? And, the last number of years, we put, a lot of regulation, a lot of compliance requirements. And I think Europe is looking at itself as to how it can become more competitive. It wants to grow its own indigenous technology sectors. Of course it does. But it wants kind of dynamic global players as well in the European market. So I think if anything, when I say it's part of the conversation, I think it's part of the conversation in terms of maybe more proportionate, sensible, streamlined regulatory approaches that could actually benefit US business. So again, like the opportunity for US business in the European consumer market, it remains the standout wealthiest jurisdiction for US companies to operate abroad. It's an incredible prize. So the EU has a lot to offer in terms of kind of reaching and bringing forward resolutions with the US. And I do think that services will be part of that conversation. But I think we all globally, through the WTO, OECD, need to kind of advance the understanding of that integration between, services and manufacturing and the blend that is the kind of modern economy. It's not the US or the global economy of the 1960s. But back to one of your earlier points, and kind of Larry has kind of touched on it, the phrase that we've been hearing a lot this week has been New World Order, and there clearly is a vision, for a new world order here in the US. And I think, what we've noticed in business circles is, there was an initial euphoria. There definitely was a sugar rush in terms of what the administration might do for the economy and for business. That has very much faded. The air has gone out of that balloon over the last 4 weeks or so. And the politics of the market numbers, of the inflation numbers, of the stock markets, of employment growth, all of that will really matter. So how can that kind of balance the vision of a new world order versus the realities and the political realities of short-term economics, and where they're going to mix, I think ultimately is where we're going to see more sensible resolutions. How quickly that comes is anyone's guess.
Larry, just to work that point about the New World Order in, your point about the changing nature of American conservatism, it's often said that, the modern American Trump Republican Party feels more aligned with Russia, Putin's Russia, than it does with Western Europe these days. And of course, J.D. Vance gave that sort of outlined that at the Munich Security Conference a while back. How do you see, in terms of a new world order, do you see that an alliance between the US and Russia as emerging, as seems to be emerging from this?
I'm not sure at any level that that's feasible. I know that the Trump's critics very much accuse him of cozying to Putin, and indeed there are theories that Putin has something on him, or even the conspiracy theories to the effect that he is an agent of Russia. I have never put much credence in those. What I will say is that I think at a personal level, Donald Trump is drawn to Vladimir Putin for a variety of reasons. I also think within American conservatism, there is a certain kinship with Vladimir Putin, in particular among the most, I suppose, the group of conservatives who have really risen to prominence and around which the conservative or right-wing Republican axis rotates, and those are social conservatives who would very much align with Vladimir Putin on a whole host of different things. My own view vis-a-vis Europe and geopolitics and the situation in Ukraine is that Donald Trump, at a very simplistic level, is maneuvering here to get a ceasefire in Ukraine, and he isn't all that concerned about the terms thereof or the consequences that might flow therefrom. This is, in his view, a means of coming home to the people and saying, I am fulfilling a campaign promise. Joe Biden let this thing go on for a long, long time, let loads of people die, spent a tremendous amount of American money. I came into office and I put an end to the thing. Now, if that disintegrates in the short term, as it very well may, we all know that Vladimir Putin cannot be trusted. My own view is that Donald Trump at that stage will say that he has done everything he could. He brought about a ceasefire for the first time. This is a European problem for Europe to deal with. This is not something that directly implicates the United States' interests. And while that might be an objectionable statement and an unrealistic statement at many levels, my own view, again, is that his political calculus tells him that around 50%, or maybe even a little bit more than 50%, of the American people will say that sounds logical. And if he has that with him, given the nuances of the American system, he feels that he can keep going with his agenda and that the Republican Party will do well on the back of it.
Yeah. Brian, from your long diplomatic experience, where do you see the US-Russia relationship ending up?
Ending up? That's a wide open question. Well,
or maybe let me make it slightly, try and make it a better question. Do you think Trump is looking for a world where Russia has its sphere of influence in Europe? He'll hand Taiwan to China and let them have their Asian sphere of influence, and he dominates Canada and Greenland and Panama. Is it as extreme as that, or do you think he simply wants the war to end and park the whole thing and then focus on China, as some of the sort of foreign policy intellectuals in the Republican Party want? Is there a clear, are they two possible outcomes, or is it just more mixed and more messy?
Well, let me say first of all that I have zero diplomatic experience when it came to Russia at all. It was just never a focus of my career. So I'm speaking as a private citizen here entirely, just from the perspective of things. But I think it is somewhat mixed, but not in the sense that Donald Trump wants a specific outcome. I don't think he has a specific end game in mind, but I think he is very tempted and very pleased by any sort of outcome that strengthens America's hands in accomplishing some of his goals for America. I mean, whatever happens to Taiwan happens to Taiwan, but if it makes it easier to get Greenland and part of the U.S., then 100 thumbs up. Two is not enough. So that's what really worries me a lot about his approach in Russia, and trying to get a ceasefire and a peace agreement without any conditions for the terms. Because if it's anything that rewards aggression, the aggression that Russia has pursued over the last several years, then you're changing the world drastically, and you're setting up a world where strength and aggression can succeed. This is the world we had, 100 years ago or something like that, or who knows? It's hard to put an exact figure on it, but this is the way things used to be. And Donald Trump thinks America is the strongest country in the world in every sense of the word, and he wants to use that strength in ways that have not been used before, like acquiring new territory, like expanding the United States. I think he thinks that legacy would be amazing, and any agreement with Russia or any agreement with China that facilitates that and opens the road for that, he welcomes it. That's something that really concerns me.
So, Fergal, I suppose looking at the worst case scenario, and there's a really big rupture between Europe and the US, not just on the security dimension, but the trade war situation. If there's a sort of 25% tariff on EU goods announced on April 2nd, and the European Commission, the Europeans are going to retaliate, does it get into another round of the US hits back? The worst case scenario.
Like there's no question from an Irish perspective that we've absolutely been tracking kind of US economic performance rather than European economic performance over the last 15 years, and Ireland is just incredibly reliant. But on the direct investment, the FDI, but the entire trade and investment relationship with the US. And look, it is mutually beneficial. Like the value that's created for US corporates in Ireland is really, really substantial. But the risks are great. But it's interesting, just again being here in the US this week. There's no one in business saying that this is the right thing for the US economy. Business is quite concerned in terms of the impact of tariffs on the US economy. They don't see this great prize of bringing all these jobs back home. They don't see it being realistic to shake up kind of global supply chains to such a degree that it's the US benefiting from global growth rather than China, for example. Like all those things are just incredibly difficult to do. And the expectation remains that we're in this really, really disruptive phase right now, and there's so much noise, right? But that from the reality of economics driving politics, the next bid for the Republican candidacy as we get towards midterm elections, that the realities of economics are going to shape ultimately where this ends. We're seeing the damage come through in the real economy here in the US already. There's absolutely no doubt about that. And I think there's there will be a lot of influence brought to bear for more sensible economic policies ultimately. So those risks are there, Dan, because of the reliance. But I think there's just so much noise at the moment. We probably shouldn't overstate them either.
Absolutely, thank you. I dropped off there, and my thanks to Barry, my colleague, for stepping in so rapidly. So hopefully it doesn't go off again, but Barry's there on standby just in case I go down. Larry, just on the politics of that, there was this famous, I don't know whether Trump himself said it, but he could shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue and get away with it. That he seems to.
Yeah.
Did. Yeah. So he really has defied all previous political laws of gravity. Could he survive a bout of inflation that looks almost certain to come about with the sort of tariffs he's putting in place, and a bad economy? Would he be able to get through that? As he seems to be suggesting that it's a price worth paying.
Yeah, I'm reticent to say what Donald Trump can survive or can't survive politically, because the fact is he is the ultimate political survivor. He has survived what no other politician in many respects could ever have survived, at least in the past. But in this instance, I think if the tariffs have the impact of further increasing the price of consumer goods, then I think that will be very, very damaging, not just for him, but more, I suppose, immediately, and perhaps in some respects, more damaging for his presidency, is that the midterms could prove to be disastrous. And I know from talking to people in the Republican Party, as Fergal has alluded to, on the business side, on the political side, there is profound unease at a lot of Trump's rash movements with respect to tariffs. What could befall Americans if prices increase further? As we all know, the price of goods and services in the United States is very, very high as it is. And the political truth here is, I suppose, darkened by some of Trump's undeniable success, which is he has made a lot of people Republicans, people who in the past would traditionally have been aligned with the Democratic Party. I mean, people who cannot afford to absorb price increases, who cannot afford, ultimately, who might be in trouble trying to fill their tanks with gas, who might find it difficult to put food on the table for their kids. They are part of his base. So while Donald Trump says there'll be a little bit of disturbance, but that's okay, it might be okay for him and a lot of elements of the old, so to speak, conservative coalition. It is not okay for the new groupings that he has advantageously for the Republican Party brought into the tent, and how they would react, I think, is very different to how those who might, again, be more wealthy might react. So watch that space. He is not invincible on this front. This is where, in my view, Donald Trump is deeply exposed politically.
Okay.
Can I make 2 points on tariffs and inflation real quick? First of all, the U.S. is one of the least exposed countries in the world in terms of tariff as a trade as a share of GDP. So in one sense, the impact from tariffs on trade will have less inflation in the U.S. than it would in many countries, or perhaps every country. And I think also the way Donald Trump approaches tariffs, he sees them as a cudgel, not a 10-year policy. And the way he's threatening them and using them and putting them in place for a week, maybe 2 weeks, and then taking them off, it's not going to move the inflation needle much at all. I mean, there might be some anecdotes about somebody who bought the car at just the wrong time and, oh my God, Trump screwed me over. It's terrible. But then with more noise, it's just going to go away. It's just an anecdote that no one will really remember too long, as long as those tariffs don't stay in place very long. So I think that's the real big variable in terms of inflation and the trade policy.
Okay, and you raised a good point that I saw a Goldman Sachs study saying that inflation could be changed by a percentage point, maybe 2 percentage points, with extensive tariffs, which is, to your point,
extensive tariffs. Yeah.
Very closed economy, and it doesn't import very much relative to most other economies in the world. Brian, I wanted to ask you a further question. All governments listen to the business community. They listen to people who create employment, and that affects all countries' diplomatic stance. Do you see that having changed a lot in the United States? Do people in business really not have the influence over policy? Because most businesses don't want this sort of disruptive stuff around tariffs on, tariffs off, tariffs at all. Is the Republican Party much less open to the voice of economic actors in business than previous U.S. administrations going back decades?
Yeah, I think that's an extremely astute observation. And yeah, I think more politicians in general are more in tune to the public. And the problem is with the public is economic illiteracy is, well, if it's not at an all-time high, it's at an all-time importance. People don't understand how tariffs work. People don't understand how reshoring works and what it takes for the whole cycle of things. People want things to be simple and simplified. And when Donald Trump throws out a number like 25%, it sounds really simple. It sounds great. They trust him in general because they believe he knows more about economics than they do. In a sense, it doesn't matter if Donald Trump understands economics or not. He says something, people believe it, and they're going to follow. And the Trump policy is going to follow that general belief more than it's going to be influenced by what business says is a good idea, because business knows that the world is complex, that the world is complicated, that things are not simple and easy, and you make one decision and there's so many knock-on effects that you conclude that A causes B, and that's the end of it. It's not the end of it. But most voters hope that it is, and when Donald Trump says that it is, then they often believe that. So Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. The business is less influential than ever before, and I don't see that changing in the short term because I think you really need voters to understand things better before that changes.
Larry, just to flip that the other way, the EU side is very much targeting its retaliatory tariffs on the electoral districts where there are Republicans in the hope that they will be damaged more, and those elected representatives will then, that'll feed up the chain. So if Europe hits, bourbon with tariffs, and that affects employment in the whiskey industry, the elected representatives in those areas will start hearing it from their constituents, and that will feed up. Has that mechanism been broken? Now, we haven't seen it yet because Europe hasn't retaliated, but do you see that as one way business will be able to influence by going to Washington and saying, we're losing jobs here, this is hurting us?
Yeah, potentially. And I don't think, as I said, against the backdrop of already high prices, I don't think there's any appetite for that, in the extent to which European tariffs could damage people in, again, Republican states. That could prove very problematic for Donald Trump politically, because it comes back to the old rule of politics that in Washington, D.C., at least, the idea is everything is about re-election and covering one seat. And if Trump starts to hear negative messaging from then again, he's got a big problem on his hands. In many respects, the question becomes, at a political level, just how loyal are grassroots conservatives and Republicans to Donald Trump? How long are they willing to weather whatever storms might be on the horizon? We don't know the answer to that question just yet.
Yeah, but I do think jobs will have more of an impact than inflation will. Jobs will really be the place where it could go south quickly.
Yeah.
Thank you. Exactly 5:30, coming to an end on schedule. I'd like to thank all of you for joining. I know you've all had a busy week, and I hope we teased out a lot there. And I hope it didn't jump around too much between topic, but I certainly found it very interesting. And thank you all again for giving us your time this afternoon.